a little confused. So for any of the doctors, you talk about figuring out a level of stimulation that made the electrical system ready to stand, and another level of stimulation, a pattern stimulation that made it ready to walk. And then you have all these other autonomic aspects that you didn't even expect. I'm just wondering, how much was it trial and error? Did you know from in identifying these specific patterns and level of stimulation?
Sorry. Susan, this is Susan Herkema. I think the best way to try to make it clear about this type of stimulation is, and it's in one of the figures in the paper, but if you can imagine that and there was a lot of work going into determining what the parameters are, and it's probably beyond the scope of this discussion, but a lot of work went into that. But when we had a particular pattern, when Rob sat in his chair, there was no movement. There was no muscle activity. So the stimulation is constant. Then he would lean over and put some weight on his legs, and that would induce him to stand up and be able to stand. So same stimulation parameters. When there's no information coming back to the spinal cord about standing or stepping, there's no response. But when the loading of the legs occurred, a standing pattern emerged and he was able to stand. Then with exactly the same stimulation parameters, we turned on the treadmill and we started moving his legs in a walking pattern. Then the neuromuscular pattern, the muscles started firing very differently. And so that's what we mean by finding a level of stimulation that just allows or excites the system so it can interpret that information that comes back and then make a decision about what motor patterns should be executed. In regard to the autonomic, that needs a lot more study. It was, one obvious answer is that it's an exercise phenomenon. If you can imagine that you had to sit down for 4 years, you could imagine that your muscles would be weaker, that you would be out of breath if you tried to stand up, that your heart wouldn't be functioning exactly the same way. Your bones are going to get weak. So one possible answer to that is that there's an exercise phenomenon. Another possibility is that the circuitry is so integrated and these pathways overlap. So the stimulation itself might also have activated inherent pathways to improve these different functions. And also, our body, the physiology of our body is dependent on all the systems interacting. So if you really drive one system to behave differently, it's going to affect other systems. Those are all possibilities. I mean, there's many more studies that need to be done for us to really identify and understand the mechanisms that result in that.
This is Reggie Edgerton. Let me add, certainly you should not have the impression that all of this has occurred randomly. It's, as I said earlier, it's really based on decades of work. And we have made extensive observations in the rat, and much of what we've seen in the rat, we've basically shown that qualitatively the same thing can happen in a human subject. But in addition, we observed these other things which we had not anticipated because we had not studied these other observations related to autonomic control, for example. We have not studied the recovery of voluntary motion. But so we really got more than what we anticipated. So it was based on the evolution of ideas over a pretty long period of time.
This is Jonathan Hodes. Rob had undergone 280 training sessions over a period of 3 years prior to implantation of the electrode. And before the electrode was implanted, when Rob would stand up, his blood pressure would drop, his heart rate would go skyrocketing. So I think that while it is empirical, in thinking that the epidural spinal stimulator was what changed his orthostatic hypotension to no longer having orthostatic hypotension when he stands and his heart rate remaining within a normal range. It seems logical that as we progressed with the epidural stimulation and training, that the autonomic changes were somehow related directly to the epidural stimulation.